Hi, this is Dr. Carl Goldkamp. If you're interested in learning about the ketogenic diet like I was to save my own life, then this is probably the podcast for you. 8 years ago, I knew nothing about it. 6 years ago, it saved my life. 3 years ago, I started researching and talking with some of the authorities in the field and attending medical conferences about this to understand why and how keto so dramatically changed my and my wife's Judy's lives. The purpose of this podcast is to share our journey of discoveries with you in understanding how keto is so effective in improving so many different conditions, from obesity, epilepsy, diabetes, infertility, MS, Alzheimer's, heart disease, to name a few. So take a step away from all the hype you've probably heard and roll up your sleeves with me and join me weekly to explore this living miracle that anyone can access. We'll talk science, we'll talk food. We'll explore its history and evolution to today, which is that the sheer wonder of the ketogenic way of eating has changed untold number of lives, unlike anything before it. And in case I forget to mention it, please join our Facebook group, Keto Naturopath. Hi, this is Dr. Goldkamp, and welcome back to another episode of the Keto Naturopath. This week, I want to take an entirely different turn away from testosterone and talk about an aspect of the ketogenic diet that I think is pretty controversial. And it has to do with addiction. Okay, then. So it goes this way. If you were to actually look at people who are overweight, and you could say any degree of overweight, from your own sense of I need to lose excess pounds of fat to somebody who is obese, and then beyond that, if you looked at that as not a caloric issue, they've been consuming too much, the calories in, calories out model, which we generally think does not work. I mean, it works on a real basic level. Obviously, if you stop eating, you'll start burning your fat, and eventually you get to a point that you'll either die, A, because you've starved to death, or you've actually lived long enough due to your fat supplies. So, but generally speaking, if we simply say calories in, calories out, somebody wants to lose 10 pounds of fat, and we'll assume that they have 10 pounds of fat to lose, then, and we simply say, okay, we start subtracting the calories on a daily basis. Yes, in part that will work. And that's called calorie restriction, obviously. But it's not a pleasant way to go. And there's other ways to look at that. And usually, by the way, those who approach it in that way of calories in, calories out, you simply need to work out more and cut your calories, and you're good times a week, a month, a couple months, a year, or whatever. Then that gives you your equation of how many pounds you'll be down. Usually they don't work long term. Usually the next 6 months after they've stopped doing it, they tend to put the poundage back up. So in terms of, and a study just came out from the University of Bergen in Norway, and why that's interesting is because I'm an alum of the University of Bergen in Norway. I didn't graduate there, so maybe that's a technical difference. I studied there for a year and a half back in, we'll leave the dates out of that one. But I basically emailed the departments of neuropsychology in this particular case. It was a study of long-term diet treatment programs over the last 50 years. And they went through a lot of different studies and saying basically long-term or diet treatment plans, weight loss plans do not work long-term. That was their conclusion. So I thought, well, isn't that interesting? And it was fun to go back and forth with them in my old school. I still speak some Norwegian. I can get by at an embarrassing level, I'm sure. So, but what's interesting about it, you take that, let's just say that's true without debating and going line by line of all the references they use and the charts and so on and so forth. Let's say that that's true. So why is that? Why do you think that is? Why is there return to kind of where they were before? Well, I would say, looking from the outside, it means the mechanism, the reason, the core reason for gaining the weight in the first place was never really addressed. Okay. Some of you are saying, okay, smart guy, what is the core for why people put on pounds when they really don't want to put on pounds? And I would say it's an addiction model. And so what do I mean by an addiction model? Well, I'm going to take a few baby steps to lead up to this Shazam moment. And by the way, I'm not really the first person to come to this particular realization. In fact, there are weight loss programs that go into this direction. Or you might say weight loss is secondary to an addiction program, and that gave us certain keys. Okay, so let's go forward a little bit. So to the addiction model, I sort of let that cat out of the bag. And what does that mean? What is addiction? Addiction can mean a lot of different things. So basically, let me see if I can give you a nice clean definition of addiction. Addiction is basically a need to do a behavior or have some sort of substance, biochemical substance in your blood. So it's either through injection or eating or breathing that you get this substance. And what is this substance? We can do medicines do this. Some of the obvious addictions are nicotine, alcohol, sex, opiates, morphine, which is part of the opiates and all the narcotics, et cetera, et cetera. So you get a sense, but what is it that does? It gives us, some of you are saying, well, it gives a kind of sense of euphoria. Okay, well, what is that about? Let me boil all this down, is that in the mid-50s, there was a really interesting experiment or research done in Miguel in 1954. And this was looking for the pleasure center of the brain. What happens to the pleasure center of the brain? And so what they documented is they did this study that rats could push a bar, and I'm reading now, rats could push a bar to have their pleasure center, your pleasure center electrically stimulated, or they could push a bar for food. So feel good or eat, feel good or eat. And what they found is that for the rats, electric stimulation for the pleasure center was more rewarding than that for food. In fact, the experience was so rewarding that starving rats would ignore food in favor of the pleasure that is stimulating his or her brain center. Isn't that interesting? Some rats stimulated their brains more than 2,000 times per hour for 24 consecutive hours. In fact, most of the rats died of starvation. Wow. So that's saying addiction or cravings, however you want to say it, really is based on a neurochemistry. So we're going to call these neurotransmitters, in which they are. We'll break them down a little bit. And this is why it's going to get interesting, but I'm going to read you a few more little context here. We know that many serious drug addicts forget to eat and shed weight, similar to the rats in this study that I just talked about. This explains why when we're getting our dopamine fix from others, there I go, there's a dopamine. That's one of the neurotransmitters. When we're getting our dopamine fix from other sources, including the first stages of love or other enjoyable activities like dancing, singing, soulful conversation, good things, good natural things, we tend to eat less. And we are less likely to overeat, you might say. The addiction is not the food, as the rats studied, given they're rats and they're not humans. But there's on this particular thread of a concept, we're pretty similar. The addiction is to the dopamine high. And so what happens when there's when the mechanism is faulty, we become obsessed to something that's going to give us that dopamine high. So now what we have is the end goal, or one of the very major influences to our sense of feeling good is going to be dopamine. And so we're going to look for whatever is in the environment to give us this. So for some it's drugs, for some it's an activity, or for some it could be food, and it could be certain types of foods, as you can guess. So we've evolved that, and it goes this way. If you can remember back to the interview that I did with Dr. Palmer, and also the interview I did with Joan Iflin, who is focused on food addiction, Dr. Palmer's interview, it was that, dopamine was the reward, feel good because you did something that is going to increase your personal survival and or survival of the species. Therefore, acquiring food, killing these dangerous animals and eating those, and that's just food for the village. Procreation, sex, you got a reward for that. So if you think of it in that context, it had an evolutionary benefit, survival benefit, And then you go, okay, that's dopamine. Well, now we're in a different era in which we've now are very clever and can find things out online and so on and so forth. There's lots of different things that will get our dopamine up. Most of them are illegal for the most part, or you have to have an excess amount of them. So when it comes down to dopamine, so here we still haven't finished with the idea of what is the addiction, is that the problem with the dopamine acquiring behavior is that what you're after was that peak influence. There was that peak experience. You felt so good when you were in love, or you feel so good when you are in love. We used to see this in the clinic, by the way. This now goes back 20 years when I was just working for HIV patients, and I was the alternative practitioner, one of the alternative practitioners. And so you'd have weekly viral load numbers, there's CD8, CD4s, and such. And you'd find that with HIV, if you don't know, it's a virus that attacks the immune system, unlike viruses that attack other parts of the body. And so they're generally low numbers. But they would find when one guy in particular who is in love, his numbers didn't make sense. He was coming up to kind of almost normal. And, we're thinking, well, maybe the acupuncture he's getting is superlative. And who is this guy doing the acupuncture? It wasn't totally me, by the way. Or maybe he's taking the right supplements, or maybe he's doing a kind of medicine. So they were going for all these different things. And then they found out that he had met somebody and, he was in love. We're watching the effect of love on his immune system, secondary to his dopamine experience. Pretty cool, huh? So you can transfer the substance or make that story about a different substance. It would create a pretty similar experience. So what happens when you back away from the peak experience, it doesn't feel quite as nice. So let's change the substance to something a little more dangerous, a little more malevolent. So let's say the latest OxyContin, hardly the latest, over the last decade or so, OxyContin epidemic and all the deaths and so on, is that OxyContin obviously is a pain reliever, but it makes people feel really good. So they feel really good for a while, and they have very elevated dopamine levels sustained for a number of days, if not a number of weeks. And there's where it gets to be dicey, is that you need to make sure the acute pain is not so acute that they can't do life. So that's the point of the analgesic effect of the opiates, OxyContin. So, but when it comes time to, okay, now we got to go back to normal life, this medication has set a new normal for them. They're used to this peak experience. And so to be less than peak is going to leave them feeling deficient, below. And so they're then trying to fill in that gap as they back away with a lower and lower dose, or they fall out of love, or cigarettes are that way too. You're taking fewer cigarettes. How do you fill in that gap? You go through a physical withdrawal. So that's an addiction. You go through a physical withdrawal once you have become dependent upon this thing. Not all addictions have to do with dependence, and certainly not all dependence have to do with addiction. That's read out of Wikipedia, by the way, if you look under addiction, which is good to know. So the problem is about dopamine, and what we find that in looking at the brains of addicts. So now Nora Volkov, she's been mentioned in a number of podcasts, especially started with Chris Palmer and a few others. And ideally, it'd be great to talk to her. She's been on 60 Minutes and others. And so when she came out of med school, not the CAT scan only, but the PET scan, which is the glucose uptake of the brain to find out what part of the brain is active during different activities. Well, they went and they were just scan happy. They were PET scan happy, and they took every condition and they said, let's do a PET scan of this guy and that guy and this woman, that woman, and sort of get a demographic of the brain on a per condition basis. And so what she noticed was there's a brain profile of an addicted brain. So what an addicted brain shows that it can't create adequate amount of dopamine. So if you looked at a normal brain, you'd say there's quote unquote normal amounts of dopamine in the brain. It would be color coded. Then you looked at the various addicts, regardless of what they're addicted to, You can say addict, cocaine addict, nicotine addict, so they would differentiate by what that substance was, but they had a similarity, and that is they couldn't get enough dopamine. So they were always in the deficient mode of, I need more dopamine. They're not thinking they need more dopamine. They're thinking they need more cigarettes, or they need more OxyContin, or they need more cocaine, or they need more sex, or it'd be nice if they felt they needed more soulful conversations. That would be a nice way to go. But anyway, so they're in this deficit. So what happens in the personality that develops around this addiction is it's about getting excited, getting a craving for that thing you're after. And when you see, if you're an ex-smoker or a smoker who are maybe just an addicted smoker, and you don't have any cigarettes and I have a pack of cigarettes, you just seeing that pack of cigarettes, regardless of whether you think you're going to get it or not, is that your dopamine goes up. So your dopamine goes up in anticipation of the thing that's going to make you feel good. So then I give you the cigarettes. And guess what? Your dopamine actually goes down upon receiving and using that thing. So it's about the anticipation of, not the acquisition of, is really the profile of what an addict is in this context that we're talking about right now. Okay, well, that's pretty interesting. So now you see the different brain scans, and we look over and we find that Nora Volkov goes, well, wait a minute. The brain scans of obese people that are heavily overweight. I'm going to use the word obesity. It's just easy to use that one word. So you can say people who are heavily overweight. In obesity is a BMI, basal metabolic rate, basal metabolic index referenced number. So we'll just say for all people who either feel they're very overweight, who are very overweight, we'll say obesity, whether it's morbid obesity or not. And she noticed that those brains, PET scans, looked a lot like the addict's brain scan. Well, then you're asked the question, if that's the case, let's say they're equal. It's just another brain you put into that category of addicted brains, or the morphine, the OxyContin, the nicotine, the whatever it is, all these different things. And you say, this brain, this obese brain profile fits right in there. Therefore, what is the thing that is driving their need? What is that substance that gave them such a pleasurable benefit? What was the thing that if they got it would drive up their dopamine? So you could say it was food. Well, food's a little bit too general. If you follow them around, it comes out to, let me introduce you to a drug called carbohydrate. So this is basically the new concept, a fairly new concept. The carbohydrates are very addictive. Now, carbohydrates, as we've talked about before, covers a lot of territory. It's the carbohydrate in lettuce. Is that going to be equal to the carbohydrates in a Twinkie? That's going to be equal to the carbohydrates in dairy, or carbohydrates in your Captain Crunch cereal, or your carbohydrates in your whole grain bread or your rice? I would say for the most part, yes. There's some that are what they call more complex and so on and so forth, but carbohydrates in general stimulate by creating your blood glucose to go up, and it's a sugar high. So literally it's a sugar high, a glucose high. A glucose high that then drives an insulin high, then drives a glucose, hypoglucose. So you're down in glucose, hypoglycemia. So anyway, the point is, if you start to look at carbohydrates as a kind of drug, it is a drug. Now we have from the brain down that is the same response, then wouldn't it make sense that you should set up a weight loss program, treatment center, to be based along an addiction program? So a lot of addiction programs are called detox centers. He went into detox, she went into detox. That's an okay reference, but I find that rather general. It's, you can say, so what do they do? And there's 1,000 different ways, but it comes down to this. One is that a center, an addiction treatment center. So whether it's the 12-step or the Al-Anon or all these others, they're still trying to do the same thing. They're trying to keep you off that substance long enough so that this is just by you understanding, right? You sit in a room, a basement of some church, and there's a big circle of chairs, and you go around and you talk about your week. And as Joan Iflin would say, those mirror neurons, it's important to be sitting and seeing other people trying to raise up the quality of their life, trying to step away from that substance that you all have in common, whether it's alcohol or certainly narcotics or something else. But that visualing, seeing other people doing this reinforces you by your visual cortexes in the back of your brain to say, we're on the right track. And it starts to let go of the need. So there really is a neurotransmitter change, kind of a down regulation, if you will. The need starts to disappear. Some will say, and especially you hear this in regards to alcohol, well, this person's a dry drunk, hasn't had anything to drink for 20 or 30 years. And so they've already had whatever change is going to take place, but they still have that desire. So part of the things you need to do is to step away from the places that served that substance or you experience those particular unhealthy dopamine highs. So and that usually takes about 21 days. So that's why you see a treatment center is about 30 days. It covers the 21 days. Those initial changes, which is a big change to the triggers. The trigger could be a location, could be a person, could be a thing. Whatever those triggers were for that person, those triggers will be less likely, less influential. So that's part of the things to do, is simply to remove them from the context. That's why you go away someplace. They also give them good diets and so on and so forth. So back to the theme of, so with all these addicts, what if all these addicts had that in common, but what now if you took the carbohydrate addicts, so the wing of this great big complex we're looking at, and we have a wing of carbohydrate addicts. And well, what else is going on? So it's not so much we're going to say you can't have carbohydrates. I mean, you could have carbohydrates, but we're now going to pretend we have a brain scan mechanism, a PET scan mechanism that can easily be checked on a daily basis to see how people are doing, that the carbohydrates, the glucose that was produced, and the subsequent changes in the body, neurologically speaking, neurotransmitters are driving up the dopamine. We're going to see how, well, that's going to change a little bit, and that your body's not going to need as much dopamine, we're hoping. And that generally takes care of things. So dropping back the amount of carbohydrates, changing the kind of carbohydrates, ideally. You could even go to none, but certainly moving away from the refined to the complex, to the fresh vegetables and kind of thing. If you're heading in that direction, it's a far better place to go. And it's a step-by-step sort of modifying your drug, if you will. It's a little bit like saying you're giving cigarettes with less nicotine over time, so they still have a cigarette, but they have less nicotine. And we're going with the assumption that nicotine is the addictive substance in cigarettes for this conversation. Okay, so they have that going on. But the part that's missing, generally speaking, for dealing with carboholics, carbohydrate people who are addicted to carbohydrates, is that we don't look at neurotransmitters. So yes, look at dopamine. Yes, look at first dropping their required amount of dopamine that they had previously got themselves to believe they needed every day by eating a lot of carbohydrates, just like a drug addict needed a lot of drugs just to keep his high. So now we're dropping that down. They don't need that high anymore. But so we're getting by on less and less than that. But what can also change is that so people don't have to feel the opposite of dopamine. To be a dopamine low is diseases like Parkinson's. So Parkinson's actually is a disease in which they inherently produce less and less dopamine, and they have rigidity. They have a lot of interesting decline, if you will, interesting from the perspective of just observing, that is strictly due to dopamine. So the opposite of being truly dopamine deficient in one's life, well below normal, is to be a Parkinson's patient. However, one can get I wanted to follow that theme for a second. On Parkinson's patients, they have some new sort of research in the last 5 or 10 years that looked at, well, do Parkinson's patients ever become addicted to something given their medications? Because their medications are about keeping their dopamine levels up, sometimes too high. And there are studies to show that in Parkinson's patients that have had sustained elevated dopamine due to their medications, they have become addicted to, and gambling addiction. So you had these people that were actually almost introverted, generally speaking, most of their life before their Parkinson's, but just had sort of a quieter life. Suddenly they're out there being gambling addicted, and I think a few other addictions as well. So it can happen, and it does happen around dopamine. Okay. But what else could we do? Well, the idea of the ketogenic diet, why would that fit in here? Well, one is you could say, well, we're saying low carb. So they're having low carb, so they're making less glucose. So that's going to eventually sort of stabilize with time, we hope, right? So the insulin will come down, and glucose will kind of be a boring flat line for a while for the most part, because we've changed their diet. And we haven't changed their diet counting calories. We've changed their diet on saying restricting on a per person basis how much carbohydrates they should have in a day. And so for that, we can follow them around with those continual glucose monitors. That was pretty interesting. And so that's what we're doing so far. And that would help produce perhaps maybe some ketones, but we have to add in the fats. And here we find if you give something like C8, so C8, we've talked about that. That's a saturated fat that quickly can be converted into ketones within 15 minutes. Now, you have ketones help stop the jitters of Parkinson's. Now, isn't that interesting? So it's not dopamine so much, it's producing ketones. So let's think that through. Well, we know that ketones help produce GABA, gamma-aminobenzoic acid. So GABA is this neurotransmitter that makes everybody feel good. Is they're tranquilized out. They're on the middle of a yoga floor by themselves, just quietly meditating. More of a meditation than it is yoga. Just meditating, very blissed out, whatever the image is of you. Floating on a raft, in the sun, on a lake, maybe that's your GABA place to go. But that's what GABA is. So GABA is they call it a inhibitor. It's the opposite of an exciter. So inhibitors cut back on the excitation. So it is the opposite of glutamate. So glutamate, think of glutamine, which is a step away, but glutamate, which is in the brain and in the body, glutamate is excitatory. And they find that, for instance, certain foods stimulate a lot of excitation. It's a lot of monosodium glutamate, for instance, tends to just rattle people's brains and gets them all wired and just like eyes buzzy, and how it varies, but they're all hyper excitable. Not quite the life of the party, kind of a wired life of the party kind of stereotype. So with a person that has too much glutamate, they could be balanced by GABA. And that's basically the point of it. How do you kind of relax? How do you chill out? You chill out with GABA, you wake up with glutamate. You think of the extreme of GABA is a coma. The extreme of glutamate is a seizure. So that's why the ketogenic diet that helps produce GABA, which helps calm down glutamate or balances that ratio, tends to decrease epileptic seizures, both in children and adults across the board. So that's why that works. You simply now have supported one side of the equation. So what does that have to do with dopamine? Well, in the part of an addict, when they're euphoric, they're also producing GABA. They're calm. They're in love, remember, right? They're absolutely in love. So when you're calm, you're in love, you're creative, you're all these fun things. And you're feeling good about yourself. And so life is good, the world is good, you're good. Well, GABA doesn't produce dopamine, but it will calm down the deficiency states. Remember we talked about the deficiency states when the addict or whoever has to go out and get some more, has to go get that fix, has to feel better, they feel terrible. Well, GABA can step in there as a related neurotransmitter and calm you down. So at least you can be kind of a more thoughtful person. So let me jump a little to some of my background when I worked for, I guess it was nearly a year in Seattle. It was part of getting a special certification for acupuncture called detox acupuncture, which simply meant it was auricular. You gave ear points and you gave some face points. Primarily the one between the eyebrows called yin tongue, in addition to ear points. And you went around a circle, and from 4 o'clock to 9 o'clock in the morning, of all these people that had to come in from the drug courts that they had in Seattle. So they had to come in and get detox acupuncture. They sat with the needles in their ears and on their face for about a half hour. Then they got up and took their needles out. So what did that do? What that did, this is now in biochemical terms, is not in traditional Chinese medical terms, is that it increased their GABA. And so even though they were deficient in dopamine, where the dopamine, they wanted to get their dopamine fix, this made their drive to get their dopamine fix less. They could live with the deficiency while their body was learning to compensate to live with a lower level than their euphoric high levels were. So they would go through that, and that was a required treatment for them in lieu of going to jail for being caught with drugs. So that's what that was. So that's where GABA came in. So there's a lot of ways you can GABAize yourself. Made that word up. Some is through acupuncture, but that's what you're getting. When you come and feel that blissed part out, that's about GABA. So the idea of if you took obesity, a person heavily overweight, or yourself, and treated yourself as an addict to carbohydrates, the questions you would be saying to yourself is, what is the substance? I've already given you that answer. It's carbohydrates. First, the first baby step would be making your quality of carbohydrates, call them more natural. So you'd be doing organic salads, and you wouldn't be doing cereals, and you wouldn't be doing whole wheat bread. You wouldn't be doing white bread. You wouldn't be doing bread at all. You wouldn't be doing rice at all. So we're now moving way over there. Eventually, you could even give up all carbohydrates. There's no such thing as essential carbohydrates. I'll leave that as another topic and issue. It's not an essential thing to look at that, but dropping the amount of carbs, which is really saying we're dropping the level of blood sugar, our average, normal, daily, sustainable blood sugar is going to be lower than it's ever been before on a regular basis. Shooting for the 70s as opposed to something that was in the hundreds and 20s, nearly diabetic. That would be another thing if you look at diabetes as an addiction as well. Okay, what else would you do? Well, you'd make sure that these people were in ketosis, called nutritional ketosis on a regular basis. That would give them a little bit meditative, more thoughtfulness about their existence. And this is how we describe that kind of acupuncture, is that why was it a half hour a day, 5 days a week for X number of months? Was it helpful to these people? Is because I didn't know enough about GABA or dopamine at that point to explain it that way. But it gave them a break from their cravings to think about their behavior and what were really some of the best choices that would benefit them the most. So a little consciousness. Some people could say that was, there's no verbal exchange really. So there wasn't any cognitive therapy here, but being aware of one's choices is what they call cognitive therapy. You now are aware, and that's also part of when you go to a detox, you have the daily counseling. If you think about it, it has to do with visual mirror neurons, seeing other people in the room. That's a benefit there too. But that cognitive part, being aware that it's not just about calories you're eating. The calories you're eating just happen to be part of the package of that drugs, right? So you can say, well, let's choose a drug. Nicotine. Nicotine doesn't have calories with it. It's independent from calories. Okay, you smoke it. It has other things that come with it, potentially bad for, the other things that come with it are the tar and all the chemicals that are in the cigarettes, and they're bad for you, and they will cardiovascular and incidence of cancer for sure. So, but it doesn't have calories. Carbohydrates are great. They come with calories, so they increase your blood sugar. They will make you fat over time, which we know how that works. up with the glucose, up with the insulin, stored as fat. So when you look at, gosh, what would be some of the other things that a carboholic would think about? Is that one is maybe they should join a group of other people trying to eat fewer carbohydrates, and you measure those in a gram per day. So there's a little discipline around that. You can track yourself as an app, but for the most part, you're just trying to back away from that substance, right? You're not going to give alcohol to an alcoholic. You're going to say, no, we're not doing alcohol. We're going to have life work without alcohol. Now we're going to say we're going to do life with minimal carbohydrates, or maybe none at all. So what does that set in place? Well, we have to think about fats. We have to think about fats in our diet, and certainly some proteins. Now the fats start kicking in more ketones. The ketones start making more GABA. The GABA gives us a little more thoughtfulness about our life, a little more, which they used to say, novelty-seeking behavior. That's the sign of an addict. Novelty-seeking behavior. Used to go adrenaline junkie is another way of saying it's a highly addictive type personality. So that would settle them down, make them a little more thoughtful and say, gosh, you're not so much, you're not going to eat that bun with that hot dog. You're basically not going to have that drug anymore. And you might think about adding fats into your diet to sort of treat your situation as an addiction. So what else could you do? Well, basically, that would open the door to other exercises. So yes, meditation would be a great thing to do. You can consider meditation as a GABA-producing exercise. And now you go, that's excellent. It's not necessarily treating the dopamine, but it's allowing you to coexist with a lower level of dopamine and not mind it so much. So that's a big deal. So stepping away from the idea, count calories and go work your butt off in a gym. There's benefits, as we've talked about in other podcasts, of working out, resistance training, but it certainly doesn't take a lot of time. If I do a half hour twice a week, that's a lot. Hard. I don't look forward to it because it hurts, meaning it's uncomfortable. Not so much it hurts, I guess. So, but now you're in a place that you see better choices. You're not just reacting, and you're treating the chemicals in your brain. Isn't that impressive? We're all different, and we all know that for some, it'll be a very efficient way of treating it this way, and others maybe less so. But having this context to bring you to thoughtfulness and being aware that it's not just about calories. So let's go back to the guy in love. It's like, do I go up to the guy in love who hasn't eaten for a couple of days, but he drinks his water and so on and so forth? I go, you haven't eaten in a couple of days. Aren't you hungry? So I'm doing great. Thank you for asking, but I'm doing great. Okay, I'm glad you're doing great. Why doesn't he starve? Why doesn't he feel he's starving? Whereas if I took somebody that wanted to lose weight and say, guess what? We're not going to eat for 3 days. They're going to go, that's going to hurt. I don't want to not eat 3 days as being the sole way of losing weight. So now when people actually, and I see this a lot, and people coming in to lose weight, and whether they're with me or not with me, they go, I want to go right to fasting. That's an addict's way of entering into weight loss. And that's a sure way to not do anything constructive long-term. Yes, they will lose weight. They'll probably go too far and might even get into semi-serious issues cardiovascularly, electrolytes, and so on and so forth, because they're just going to do it. It's all about discipline for them. And that's a complete wrong direction. So if you can take a kinder way around the side and get up your GABA by dropping your carbs and getting up your fats for the most part, and keeping your proteins normal, we've been through that before, that's going to make a gentler way for you to persist long term. So you don't want to say, I've lost 80 pounds and then a year later I gained back 100. What's the point? Why don't we look at taking the substance away and giving you other substances that are a little healthier for you, so you can drop the need of this substance called carbohydrate. So I hope that's helped you to some extent. I think it's a really important issue. So let's say now you're walking around town and you see obviously some heavy people. We have plenty of heavy people to see. And I would ask you to think about two things. Here's an image I'll leave you with. If you think about the recent opioid epidemic, in which a lot of people have died from overdoses, and they think it was contrived. It was contrived. I mean, it was a real thing that happened, but it was about the drug companies and one family in particular. I won't get into it, but it's been nationwide. And that didn't exist 30 or 40 years ago. Now I want you to superimpose the obesity incidence on a per state level, 40% for West Virginia, 40% for Mississippi. And considering 30 years ago, it was about 5%, 1985, it's about 30 years ago. 30 years, it was 5%. So it's been a pretty hand-in-hand, pretty comparable diagram in terms of two addictions. So let's treat obesity, being overweight, now you can speak to yourself, as maybe you're addicted to something that if you bring a little consciousness to, let's just worry about getting a little more GABA in your life. Whether you want to go meditate over it, whether you want to go take C8, change your diet to drop your carbs, increase your fats, low carb, high fat, you will get there and you'll find that's the most sustainable way on a very sort of limited way we're looking at life in general in terms of dropping weight is like, that's a more sustainable way. So to that layer, in essence, this is how I think. And this is how I work with men who are overweight. Change it to other, to women as well. But if we look at that as the heart of it, it's an important part of it. To that, we look at nutritional deficiencies. So if you could take any addict and say, gosh, they were deficient in 2 or 3 vitamins that we saw both in their blood or through special testing called intracellular testing. And we made sure we got treated their nutritional deficiencies. How do you think they'd feel? They'd feel even better. They may not come back to feel like they're euphorically in love all the time, but they will feel more comfortable to back away and let go of that substance that they demanded to have in their life the whole time. So it's pretty amazing. So that's my thought. Think of those addiction maps in the United States over time and think about carbohydrate as an addictive substance and how you can change that. So when you go to reach into your fridge and get the ice cream or whatever else you reach for, or the potato chips and so on and so forth, here's the question I would leave with you. Are you trying to convince yourself, I deserve something now? I deserve something good? That's actually the way an addict thinks. Why don't you give yourself something that is high fat, low carb, or better yet, if you're really not hungry, bone broth or something like that, your taste will change over time to say, that was a really neat thing I had. So you're actually getting a fix when you reach into the refrigerator for those things, or wherever you go for that kind of, for those carbs, okay? So I hope you don't get mad at me. I hope it was a useful thought to think about. Let's think about weight gain differently, and therefore let's treat it like an addiction. And we may come up with a different treatment, way you would treat yourselves or others would treat you, okay? On that, good talking to you. Talk to you next week. Hi, this is Dr. Goldkamp. I just wanted to encourage you to send in your questions to drgoldkamp@ketonaturopath.com. Many of you have, and so what I've done with these questions that I've gotten back to most of the people I email, but some of the questions that were so good, and if they were overlapping to other questions, I would combine them and try to put that into the topic of a podcast, either via one of the micro topics that are covered in an interview. As you know, we cover a lot of topics in any given interview, or some of my own sort of reporting, if you will, on some of these issues. So please keep the questions coming. Feel free to send in an email, and I will get back to you. One thing I want to say, a number of questions have come in which I've given this answer and the email didn't work. So just make sure that you're receiving at the same email that you sent it in. And I think that might have been the difficulty. So I look forward to your questions. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that I'm open to answer your questions. And I think this world of keto is not just black and white. It's nice that it's simple, but it's not simple for some. I'm really trying to, go down, as anybody any of you who have listened to all my podcasts, we started way back when, history and evolution and epilepsy and so on and so forth. Now we're seeing some tremendous overlap in various mental disorders, such as schizophrenia or neurological disorders that are not just epilepsy. And also, just for people and losing weight, it's sometimes pretty complicated for them to engage in keto. And so they need some help. And so that's the whole point of, at least that's what I think I'm doing, is exploring the world of why are there other factors. And so in exploring some of those other factors, we've covered addiction, we've covered hormones, we've covered nutritional deficiencies, we've covered certain metabolic lab results, and we'll go further. We'll even get to more on genome and aspects. So these are all just contributions that make for an obstacle for some people to engage easily in the ketogenic diet. This is my belief, and these are the things that I've discovered. And I think other people have discovered some of these things, but not ever put them together. So stay listening, send in your questions, and I will definitely get back to you. Bye-bye.